Ciao. I'm Paul Rendek, Director of DStream Group, and I'd like to welcome you back from your break and thank you for participating in this session. Benvenuto a questa sessione. That's about the most Italian you're going to get out of this Canadian here. But welcome, everyone. In this session, we have two wonderful and wise gentlemen that have devoted their careers to the advancement of the internet, but also in helping fix things along the way. I am pleased that they have agreed to join us as keynote speakers in this session titled, A Changing Internet Landscape. I have the pleasure to introduce Geoff Huston and Joy Marino. Geoff Huston is the Chief Scientist at APNIC, the Regional Internet Registry for the Asia Pacific region. They are responsible for the distribution of internet number resources, IP addresses, ASNs, in the 56 economies of the Asia Pacific region. Prior to APNIC, Geoff was the Chief Scientist at Telstra, Australia's largest and leading telecom provider. He is globally recognized for his technical reports and engaging and thought-provoking findings about internet technical operations, as well as governance on the internet. Joy is an individual that needs little introduction in the Italian internet community. Among various leading positions in internet organizations, he has worked with great passion as the president of MIX for the past 20 years. You can also find Joy involved in thought-provoking debate, encouraging the future direction of the internet in Italy and in Europe. I welcome you both. So before we get this session started, actually I'd like to touch on some administration for this session. We would like to make this session as informal and inclusive as possible. So after each of the presentations that will be given, we've set aside some time for any questions that you may have. So please use the forum, or please use the Salotto platform to bring forward questions inside the session. Let's grab these two individuals for their knowledge while we have them both here. So to get the session started, I just wanted to ask them a few questions as I have them here on the screen. We have all felt the effects of a very challenging year, both personally, but also in the space of the internet. But having said this, what if we did not have this technology? Did it help us? And has it delivered?
I'll leap in there, Paul, with my views on this. And certainly, firstly, welcome to everyone. I thank you, Paul, for your smattering of Italian. Bienvenuto is about all I can manage. I am so sorry. Your question is interesting. What if we didn't have this technology at all? Many, many years ago, when I embarked on my illustrious career in the Australian civil service, it only lasted for 6 months, but my job was to count the number of people that we would have had to employ in the civil service if there hadn't have been computers at all. And the answer, even then in the early 1980s, was a huge number. And it was almost impossible to imagine. I don't think we can imagine a world without the internet. And if that wasn't around to help us now, it would have been a very, very different and perhaps bleak undertaking. We've experienced pandemics over millennia. The last one, a century ago, when there was no technology such as this, lasted for over 3 years. It kept on coming back and coming back and coming back. The lockdowns, as much as they were tried, were horrendously ineffective, and it just raged through the population of the time. It actually killed more of us than the preceding Great War. This was horrible. As bleak as this is, and it has been a terrible year, what is amazing is that the light is already at the end of this tunnel within 1 year. We've actually managed to get a scientific and technological effort to create vaccines in an unprecedented pace. We've sent the entire workforce home. We sent the schools home. We actually managed to completely change the way we operate, and we only did it through this internet. If it wasn't an internet, I really can't imagine how bad this would be. But I certainly know it'll be a lot worse than, bad as it is, we've experienced. So I'm not saying this is a walk in the park. It's been easy. No, it hasn't. But in some ways, it could have been far, far worse. So I think it's worked. Where has it fallen short, you ask? I think you'd be asking more of it than it can deliver. The internet won't give you a vaccine, people will. People still have to drag themselves through this, and the internet isn't going to do that for us. So to the bits that it has been able to help, it's been astonishing.
Mm-hmm. Joy?
Yeah, I have two consideration. One is like Geoff said, without the internet we have survived anyway. We have find a way to manage out of a plug somehow, like 100 years ago. That's obvious. Few years ago, at one of the mix Salotto, we had one of the chief policemen in Italy, who was at the time involved in cybercrime, but before that he was responsible of several investigation, very important investigation, criminal investigation in Italy. And he said, we work like cooks. We do what better we can with what we have. If we don't have it, forget. This is the case that humanity has to do when is confronted by some dangerous situation like this. What is peculiar of this is that we have dared to close down everything, supposing that we have powerful enough communication system that can overcome the limitation of the closing down. And this make possible to work, to teach and learn, even with people close at their homes. The other consideration that I wanted to offer you, I remember, because I'm old, like my friend here, when there was the first, Geoff, do you remember 1988, when there was the Morris worm, the first case of a virus, more or less virus, that affected the ARPANET at the time? It was a worm, it was almost ineffective, but it spread like a plague. And I remember some post-mortem review on ACM that said that it affected almost mainly university, because at the time ARPANET was more academic, and it was a specific plug that affected only VAX machine, very old computer at the time. Anyway, the university that under the threat closed down all internet, all ARPANET connection, takes longer to overcome. The university that keep the channels open and exchange information about the DNA of this virus. Why? How? Reverse engineering the assembly code of the machine code of the virus were the faster to recover. So communication is fundamental, and communication is either for us to survive and to continue to be social animals, and for scientists to exchange information in real time. The amount of research and research exchange and shared among the internet, among our communication channel that have been carried on this year is huge, really huge. The largest experiment in shared research that we as humanity has ever done.
It's very interesting. So this leads me to another question. You know, for years in the internet governance arena, not so much the technical arena, but maybe the governance arena, various regulatory bodies or governments have actually questioned whether or not the internet would be resilient during any time of crisis. So I can see that you both have actually touched on the point that the net has actually delivered. But there are things that humans need to deliver, as Geoff said, and this is very trying on us as humans, not on the machinery. The machinery or the internet, so to speak, has delivered, right, in its time of crisis. So I have another question. Can leaders of the internet pull together and influence a better direction? Are they in control of this?
Well, Paul, who are the leaders of the internet? And this is a great question. And being an amateur economist, I always thought the leaders in any industrial sector could be found in the stock market by looking at the capitalization of various companies and taking the biggest. And if one takes a global view of public companies, the leaders of the world's industry are Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon. And oddly enough, if they're the leaders of the internet, they're doing just fine. And in actual fact, most of their business plan is actually based on understanding what I want and meeting those needs. And so what's wrong with this picture? This is a case of an industry that has now narrowed the market to one, me, understanding my needs, which sounds a little scary, but okay, let's go with it, and meeting those needs. And could we make this better? Well, maybe Uber Eats should be predictive and deliver me what I want to eat without me even calling them. Maybe. But all this is wrong in some ways. And certainly maybe I'm old enough to remember before this, when I had a little bit more free will, slightly more privacy, and actually was slightly more in control of my life. Now, this is, I think, this fundamental problem of any social revolution. And there is no doubt this is a revolution as large as any. And, there are a few things that I can offer you advice about how to endure a revolution and make it better. Number one, that Robespierre guy, don't trust him. He's going to kill us all. The second issue is you can't stop it. And in some ways, this is inexorable progress, and we are committed down there. So the other piece of advice is we've got to come to terms with this and stop thinking that we can recreate yesterday and use the old power legislative tools. In the US, they keep on thinking that the Sherman Act, 1909, can be used to bring Google into line. Laughable. It's 110 years old and it won't work that way. And so the real challenge, I think, for all of us is to think about this world as it is today and think that we've gone beyond a whole bunch of conventional politics into different forms of social organization. And the mechanisms of self-control and common control are necessarily going to be different. And thinking that we can legislate our way out of it and apply more punitive fines on Google or Amazon and so on is not only wishful thinking, it's wrong thinking. And that means, I suppose, we don't understand what the answers are. And in some ways, it's not let's use more technology, but let's use more people. And let's use ourselves to think beyond yesterday, to understand as societies how we come to grips in this entirely different, entirely new world where we can't back out. We're committed. We're going there. And we can either be led there by a small bunch of capitalists who are ultimately only concerned about themselves, or we can go there together and actually get this back into a meaningful social contract. Easy to say, it will take us a generation or two. I can only wish
Very
us all
difficult.
luck.
Very difficult. Yeah, very good point. Joy?
Yeah, I have some random consideration. One is that several years ago, we were thinking that we were those who understood how internet worked, And hearing politicians speaking of internet, we thought that we know how it works. They are trying to apply older paradigms to a new things, and they didn't understand how it worked. But now I feel myself older, and I have the sensation that people like me, I don't talking for you, uh, uh, um, are trying to use the old internet paradigm to understand, to make sense of what is going on. My sensation is that these things, I used in the past several times the idea that this is a live things, something has a life of its own. We do not understand it anymore. The idea that these things that we call internet has been able to survive several changes, several architectural changes, it has been able to survive two different approach to net neutrality or unneutrality 5 years one after the other, or few years before we have Obama, and then we have Trump, completely different. It survived anyway. So it's something of its own. That means that I don't think that the experts, technical or old architects of internet have a say in guiding the internet. But I think, anyway, that we, better than others, better than politicians, better than the large public, are able to perceive how some little bits, some small pieces of the internet, we are still there. The architecture, the basic architecture is still the same. This little bit have an influence, a long-range influence on what will happen. And somehow we can say, okay, please pay attention to this bit. This is 0, this is 1, it makes a difference. The problem is that the latest example I have of a bit of the architecture that we try to influence, as Geoff said several times in the past, and today I know in this presentation again, we failed. We dramatically and failed. We've decided long time ago to switch to IPv6, which is an important architectural and overall change in the internet, and we failed. So our influence is small, even in this architectural, technical little bits, who has a long-range influence. But I think that a kind of internet will survive because it is life of its own anymore.
Sure. So again, we're back to dialogue between humans. The machines seem to be working just fine. All right. So very interesting indeed, gentlemen. Okay, well, let's get started on our presentation. So first up, I'd like to ask Geoff to present to us.
Thank you, Paul. And again, welcome to all from the middle of the night in Australia. It is indeed, though, a real pleasure to join you here this afternoon. And yes, I really wish that I was in Italy, and Milan seems like the place to be. But nevertheless, I'm here in this weird Zoom void of video, and we'll make the best of it. I want to talk today about technology. Next slide, please. Because I think the story about why technology goes in particular directions and not others is actually fascinating. As Joy has already pointed out, sometimes we build this bright, shiny thing, IPv6, for example, and we get it wrong. Somehow it's just not working. Other times it succeeds and it's sort of, we weren't expecting that. Next slide, please. There's this fascinating, absolutely fascinating view done originally in the New York Times, looking at the amount of time it takes for domestic technologies to actually get used, to actually become adopted universally. And this is, of course, in the US, but I think the picture is very similar. Can we imagine a world without electricity in everyone's home? Well, today it's sort of as meaningless as trying to think of a world without mobile phones. Yet, nevertheless, it took 50 to 60 years in the US to get electricity everywhere. It was long, it was slow, it took a huge amount of time. Next slide. And so sometimes this technology actually takes an extraordinary amount of time. The telephone, 80 years. Cell phones, these things. I can't imagine the world without having one in every single pocket. I can't imagine going somewhere and not being able to say to whatever, in fact, sorry, I'm not holding it to my ear, I'm tapping away doing messaging. 20 years ago, there was no such thing. Nothing. Even the internet, which really in its mainstream consumer technology phase is just 15 years old, the pace of technology is very, very different across different kinds of technology. Next slide. So the real thing that I think we have to ask ourselves is, what's the driver? What allows this to actually be adopted? Is it the fact that it's useful? Utility? Is it because people like you and me want it? I'm buying a new mobile phone every 2 years. I'm like, this is consumer demand. But am I buying it because I want a new one or because my provider has told me I need a new one? Is it me or is it push? Or maybe I'm a victim of marketing. Maybe all of this is actually about the subtle messages that pervade my life and my computer screen about marketing telling me what I really need. Is it because it's cheaper? Do I select things based on my perception of cost, which is where, a lot of the study of consumer economics fits? Or, is it just that companies drive technology that gives us the greatest profit? Or maybe it's a social thing. Maybe it's just the fear of missing out. Everyone else is doing it. I should do this too. What drives it? Next slide. I'm not sure that there is a unique answer, but oddly enough, I think cost has a huge amount to do with this. Massive. Because in some ways, the economy is not elastic. There's a sort of fixed amount of money. Certainly, if you talk to my employer, there's a very fixed amount of money that I get paid with. And it's my job to take my income and meet my requirements, substituting one service for another within the same domestic economy. And we all operate like that. And so things that are cheaper tend to be driving change. One of the things about the internet, strip out everything else, and you get down to circuits versus packets. The old telephone system was a circuit switched real-time system. The packet switch network that is the internet is cheaper, and not just a bit cheaper, 100 times cheaper. When you get a change of cost of 100 times, imagine if cars were 100 times cheaper. In fact, I don't think I want to. The roads wouldn't work. The change is large enough when you get 100 times cheaper to destroy the existing market. And certainly most of the old world telcos don't exist anymore. AT&T, the largest telephone company in the world, basically got sold off as junk some years ago inside this revolution of the internet. Big cost reductions, big change. Smaller cost reductions, lesser change. Almost no one has a big mainframe computer in their basement. Or if you're not, get rid of it. It's not needed anymore because these days everyone's on the cloud. But oddly enough, the companies that service the cloud are actually not much different from the companies that are associated with hardware. IBM still exists. A lot of these service companies changed what they did, but still provide service. And the cost reduction is not that dramatic. It's not 100 times cheaper. It's maybe half or 4 times cheaper. And that moderate change has actually allowed some of the incumbents to tag along. Microsoft hasn't died yet, and it's unlikely that it will. It's riding through this change. Some more examples. I don't know about you if you run your own website, but I've done 1 or 2 in my time. Domain name certificates was something I needed to pay for, and pay a lot. These days I go to Let's Encrypt and I get it for nothing. I don't think anyone is still out there selling domain name certificates, and in even 2 years' time, they're all gone. The market is destroyed. Massive cost reduction, basically complete. What about others that haven't been cost-driven? This is a good case in point. In terms of my economy in my house, I'm actually spending more on this mobile device than I was ever spending on my fixed wire telephone. So it's actually gone up, yet everyone has one. Everyone has one. Why? Because it's really useful, because utility, because it's a higher perceived value for me. So I bought one. I keep on buying them. We all do. So sometimes it's cheaper, sometimes it's better. Next slide. Now, who provides these technologies and why? Well, some providers are what we call early adopters, early movers. It's a competitive market out there, and as I suppose was the big change that the internet actually rode upon. If there wasn't deregulation in the telco sector, the internet would never have happened. Telcos never wanted it. So what you find in a competitive market that's open is that some providers do see a distinct advantage to jump early. And if they make the guess right, if they jump on a future mainstream technology, they've got a first mover advantage and they're done. Google did not exist in 1980 or 1990. Google's now one of the largest companies in the world. Not the largest, but certainly one of them. Why? First mover. And in some ways, if you can offer better utility, better security and safety in these new technologies, you will win the market. Early adopters, if they see an advantage, will jump. Next slide. Sometimes, though, it's not as clear as that. Sometimes it's not so obvious. No one marketed IP version 4. It just sold itself. We've been marketing IPv6, it seems like forever. 30 years, I think, is coming up pretty soon. And it's been, well, a train wreck. We've been contemplating how to do it for so long, I think we're actually never going to do it. It's a failure. Security on the internet. Well, if you look at the cyber attacks, security is a failure. I don't understand how secure the IP stack is in my telephone, in my web monitor, in a whole bunch of things like my car. How secure is it? I can't log into it. Does anyone care? I'd hope someone does, but maybe they don't. And by the look of the amount of attacks, malware, etc. out there, maybe no one does. Maybe all this automation is just making the ice under our feet thinner and thinner and thinner, and it's going to break. Sometimes the incumbents get so big, we just can't lever them out. Is Google now so big that no one else can be competitive against them? Is it so entrenched that the disruption that's going to take on Google is going to be massive. Next slide. So let's take a good example here, IPv6. We knew in 1990 that 32 bits of v4 address space wasn't going to last. Now, that was a big call, because even in 1990, mainframes still existed. We hadn't even dreamt of putting it in our pockets. And the whole idea that we'd get billions of connected devices was just science fiction. But nevertheless, we were dreamers. We saw that. We reckoned that we were going to go there somehow. And so we designed a new protocol that was going to be the replacement, because when you run out of addresses, you run out of protocol. So the whole idea was we were meant to have started and finished this transition to this massive protocol, 128 bits of addresses, long before we ever exhausted v4. Well, we started running out 10 years ago of v4. The central reserve pool ran out. Then APNIC. Then the RIPE NCC. We all ran out of addresses. But oddly enough, there's still a healthy market for v4 addresses. It's still lingering on. v6? Let's have a look at a graph in a second. But why is it taking so long? What are the reasons behind that? Next slide. You see, this is not a typical internet slide. This is not up and to the right. This is thinking about it. That time scale that looks like maybe short is from 2014 to today, the last 6 years. And v6 has managed to get past 1/4 of the world's users. Great! The other 3/4 aren't doing it. Not great. Why should your service provider change? I don't know. NATs work just fine. What are the drivers here behind this very, very sluggish change? This is not a hockey stick of adoption, up and to the right. It's kind of bits. Next slide. Well, if my competitor adopts v6, they don't get to steal my market. There's no adopter advantage. Most folk, now we geeks are something special. Geeks do buy based on v6, but there aren't enough of us to swing the market. So quite frankly, if an ISP doesn't do v6, no one cares. There's no clear need, because we actually found it easier to change the architecture of the entire internet than to change its address space, bizarrely. So client-server architectures don't need a universal address model, and we went client-server. We went to NATs. And oddly enough now, the network is a client-server network where addresses are not endpoint identifiers, they're something else. So what's v6 really? It's a 1990s technology to a 1980s network architecture. Today's network is neither of those. It's actually a content distribution feeder network with exchange points in the middle mediating supplier and access networks. Globally unique address plans? Meh, don't care. No device needs a universal public address all of the time. What's the point of v6? Well, the market is saying, not sure, not jumping today. Next slide. But you know, that's not the only one. Let's go into the DNS. I love the DNS. Everyone loves the DNS. It's our favorite technology, the name-based system. The problem is that when you ask the DNS a question, how do you know if the answer is genuine? You don't. In some cases, you might be asking for a name that's naughty, and your ISP or some government regulation said, no, don't give them an answer. It's bad, for whatever reason of bad. And so we added a new technology into DNS called DNSSEC that actually said, can you trust the answer? Well, let's use the power of cryptography to give you that degree of trust. Add a digital signature. If the signature matches the data, you're good. If it doesn't, someone's doing bad things to you. Don't go there. Did we adopt this? Because it seems like a really good idea. This is what we've been waiting for. Not. Increased price. It takes time, money, and effort to get DNSSEC right. A lot of time, a lot of money. And a whole bunch of folk, most of the DNS, go, well, not convinced. Next slide. So here's the graph of adoption of DNSSEC. Look familiar? Well, yes. 25% of users sit behind DNS systems that won't give you a bad answer. Great. 75% of users will happily give you a bad answer. Not good. So in some ways, again, up and to the right, not really. A long, slow, protracted, tedious transition. And that dip in the middle around 2018, well, at some point you need to roll keys. In cryptography, those digital keys don't last forever. And the incredible amount of effort we took to roll the root key of the DNS actually turned a lot of people off. And instead of trying to follow that, they just turned off DNSSEC and said, we'll turn it back on when you've changed your keys. So not working. Next slide. Why? Well, it's one more thing to go wrong. And quite frankly, none of us are even sure what the attack vectors are that we're trying to be protecting. Does your own system in your own device at the edge validate the DNS? No. Are we actually really good at lying in the DNS? Yes, we depend upon it these days. Lies are actually part of the way the DNS works. Why would I want a system that rejects lies? Well, I don't. So there's no clear use case. It's too slow to work for the web. It doesn't get all the way to the edge systems. And the DNS is so hopelessly complicated, we actually have no idea why it would work and how. So it never got adopted. So can we generalize from this? Next slide. The things about why transitions fail is actually because if you're the first person to do it and nothing changes, you're no longer an intrinsic leader in the market, your competitive position hasn't changed, then you're not going to do it. If the large incumbents are not interested, it won't happen. If there are regulatory barriers, it won't happen. If there's no consumer interest, it won't happen. And if there's no mechanism for piecemeal adoption, it won't happen. And if the alternative use models still keep on doing the job, then the transition will fail. So transitions fail for all kinds of sort of subtle reasons, but nevertheless, they fail. And we sort of got to think about this a bit more and go, well, if I want something to be changed, why is this so difficult? Next slide. There isn't one internet. There never was. The internet, as its name suggests, is lots of different networks. We deregulated the environment. There's no rule book. There's no rules you must follow to be the internet. There are many different players and each with their own perspectives. And every single solution gets explored. Mobile providers have an entirely different view of the world than enterprise service providers, have an entirely different view of the world from exchanges, content distribution networks, access networks. We all approach the market differently with different technologies. And this whole issue of deregulation and competition actually means we tend to specialize in terms of technology. There's not one internet. There's a grab bag of technologies that kind of work kind of together on good days, and on bad days, they don't. Next slide. We have no memory. We really don't. when we talk about a transition taking 5 years or 10 years, as we do with V6, you have to think back about what were your plans 5 years ago? What were your plans 10 years ago? Geez, what were your plans in 2019? Because I can assure you they didn't happen in 2020. We don't plan. There is no planning. When I joined Telstra, it was a long time ago, I'd heard about the year 2000 committee inside the company, which had been set up in 1989, 11 years before the millennial clock change. That was planning. If you look at Telstra today in Australia, you'll find that their planning process lasts about, 3 months into the future, and then they just give up. We don't do planning anymore because, quite frankly, it's a waste of time. The network changes, the environment changes. You have to optimize where you are and just push on no matter. Long-term planning is just losing the plot. Next slide. So the other part of this is even the internet itself is not the internet that certainly I grew up with and probably you knew even 10 years ago. Before, we used to have transit networks and mid-level distribution networks and access feeder networks, and everyone wanted to be a tier one, and exchanges and so on were all about peering traffic between providers. Not anymore. Not anymore. Today's internet architecture is a collection of content data networks interfacing in through a local peering exchange to feeder networks that do the last mile. In 10 years' time, it will be different. I have no idea what it will be, but it will be different again. The internet itself is a moving target. And while it's still the IP protocol, the TCP protocol, the DNS, God bless it, while it's still all of those, and HTTPS, it will be different. So what drives change? Well, it's a market, like every other market. Consumers make choices, choices drive the market. Consumers tend to show cost-based preferences or utility, depending on what you want. The greater the cost shift, the greater the change. Next slide. So this is perhaps the fundamental point, that if the cost reduction is high enough, next slide, if the cost reduction is high enough, and I've put there maybe 16 times cheaper, 32 times cheaper, but if the cost reduction is high enough, whoever was the incumbent is no longer the incumbent. They get replaced. And if the cost reduction is massive over there on the right, the market's destroyed. Next slide. So what resists change? Well, the bigger the incumbent, remember the telcos, the harder it is to change. And when they're monopolies, remember the telcos, it's almost impossible to change it. But were those situations unique to then? Well, no. The digital world is now actually populated by a very small set of monopoly incumbents, and they massively resist change. And these large-scale digital incumbents create their own challenges. Next slide. Because in some ways, that economics of innovation is not a fixed point. If the market is very open and very fluid, even a small change in the cost base forms adoption. The existing incumbents get replaced because it's easy for someone else to be competitive. But when the market monopolizes, it exhibits extraordinary inertia. It resists change. Monopolies don't like getting replaced. It's life-threatening, of course. And so you need to make massive change to have the same effect. Next slide. We built telcos over 100 years. They were monopoly incumbents for a huge amount of time, but they also, by resisting small-scale change, created what I call an innovation debt. We knew how to build an internet, 60 years ago. These are old ideas. There's nothing new in this technology. But the telcos said, don't like this. It'll undermine our working models. It'll undermine our competitive position as a monopoly. We're not going to do it. The longer that blockage remains, the greater the pressure. And eventually the pressure becomes explosive. And what actually happened with the internet is it wasn't a small change. It was indeed revolutionary. And the victim was actually the telco. At the heart of this long scale incumbency, it builds up the pressure on change. And so the pressure becomes eventually destructive and revolutionary rather than gradual and evolutionary. Next slide. So today, where are we? Well, gee whiz, we're doing it again, aren't we? The large-scale incumbents, the Microsofts, Amazons, Googles, Akamai's of this world, are bedding down. They're stabilizing their business model, and they're suppressing further innovation. They're buying their competitors. They're not competing with them. They're just swallowing them. The longer this situation lasts, the higher the innovation debt, the higher the disruption when it eventually bursts. Because we've known something for a long time. Next slide. That those who can't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And I think that's where we're going. I hope that was of interest to you. Thank you very much. Back to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Geoff. Thank you. That was a very interesting ending. I have a few questions for you just to start this off. I'll take a look and see if there are some coming from the audience. Wow, I have a few questions, but I'll start at the top. Oddly enough, I did jot down that I think tech innovation will get increasingly suffocated by the big seven. That's what I wrote down. And I said, so how do you approach this as a non-US market? Because these big seven, in my opinion, tend to be very US focused. I mean, that's just the way the internet grew. And it's funny because as technical folk, we hailed these organizations and built them up to be these monopolies you just mentioned in your presentation, when that was what we were trying to get away from when we were pushing from the telco space, right? It's very funny how your last slide talked about history repeating itself. So my question is, how do you approach this from a non-US market base, right? And the second one is, what is the disruption, Geoff? Will it be technology, or is it going to be governments and regulatory bodies?
Well, I think ultimately it's going to have to be governments and regulatory bodies, because the avenue of opportunity to disrupt the advertising market, that window closed down about 10 years ago. Because if there was competition in advertising, the incumbents would not have the stranglehold on the rivers of gold that fund everything else. Google is, at its heart, an advertising company. So is Facebook. But the problem is that they dominate that market. And as long as they dominate it, nothing else matters. They have their own little ecosystem of self-driving cars, of mail and documents and so on. That's all just how they spend the money, not how they make the money. And so if the only way to attract customers is through Google ads, we have a problem, and we do. And if the only way to disrupt that is actually to disrupt the advertising market space, to actually look at how we connect consumers and producers and who is the intermediary, do we dare to regulate that space? I know that if you ever touch the tiger, it will growl at you. If you really want to provoke Google, talk about ad blockers. If you really want to see the vulnerability of Google, talk about advertising. If you want to see the vulnerability of any of them, talk about advertising. And talk about how most of us, oddly enough, feel excessively annoyed by ads. And maybe we should think about the fundamentals of the way this new economy works and who's actually funding it before we start thinking about the technology. So I'd go with ad blockers. Shh, Google's going to hit me.
Very good point. Oh, absolutely. And that's very interesting because, at the same time, and I know where you sit on this, Geoff, just having the pleasure to have known you for quite a long time. It's surprising that you mentioned government and regulatory bodies, because it's the very thing that we really wanted to keep away from this space, right? I mean, the self-governance, that industry self-governing position.
No, Paul. Oddly enough,
go ahead.
We were doing just fine with telcos.
Right.
They were doing things that were otherwise unobtainable in a private market. The first subsea cables were laid by governments because there wasn't enough private capital. We did the telephone to every house around because private industry didn't have enough money. The reason why we did these things as public enterprises was actually they were unobtainable any other way. The problem was that even in that public space, we created an incumbent monopoly that just then sat on the market and said, this is my job, nobody else's. And we didn't know how to gently ease that out. What we had instead were these massive pressures for telco deregulation. We thought we were deregulating the telephone company. We were actually making an internet because competition came from a completely different way. It's not that regulation was bad. No.
Yeah.
It wasn't that any form of public engagement was bad. It was impossible to dismantle that public monopoly unless we deregulated. But there are many tools in the regulatory toolbox. There are many ways of incenting behaviours. And I think now the issue is we are facing what an economist would call market failure. And quite frankly, there is a role for the public sector to regain some leverage on the one thing that truly matters to us as a society, public communications. If the communication space is privatised, we're in a really dark space. If we get rid of libraries and replace it with Google's search engine, we're in a really dark place. If our whole conversation is mediated by Facebook, geez, welcome to today. It's not a nice space. And in some ways, regulation has a role about common public interest. They won't necessarily get it right. No one does.
Right.
But we need some kind of counter voice to the unconstrained monopoly voices of the big cartels out there that are simply taking the ball and running far away. So yes, I'll argue that my stint in the Australian civil service was too short and I should go back and help them.
Well, actually, this just plays into the field that it's very important for dialogue to happen by all parties, right? And that's something that's been pushed through the internet for quite some time. I have one more question for you, Geoff, if I could. Digitization. Don't we love this word? This is the new buzzword of today that I'm seeing, companies running towards this word digitization. And again, what is this buzzword kind of taking us into? It's taking us into the cloud space, right? And if I look ahead, Geoff, the cloud space is the big seven again. So even this disruption that you have that you think is moving you into a whole nother space is moving you deeper, my feeling is, into this space you're talking about. So what's your take on digitization and this cloud movement?
Be very afraid, I think, is the first way of looking at this. I'm a shocking programmer. I'm terrible at my job and I'm average. Everyone's bad at this job because software is incredibly hard. Nobody knows what's in the Boeing 737 software, not even Boeing. No one knows what's in your front doorbell that's got this fancy internet feature. Nobody. We make really crappy software. The endless stream of updates is not to make it better. It's just to keep on bailing, because if you don't bail, you drown. And so in some ways, not even the big seven, who move fast and break things, according to Facebook, have been very good at moving fast, but they've been expert at breaking everything. The fact that your car shares its entertainment system with its remote, with the driver control system now, the 300 processors, the fact that things are built from the lowest common provider, the fact that security inside software and predictability is now a joke, actually means that we should be worried about digitization, not because of the big seven, but the quality of the work we do. That we keep on going to the lowest bidder and getting the worst possible software and putting it inside critical systems. And then we wonder why at some points the traffic lights all stop. We wonder why we get these failures. And damn it, this plane falls out of the sky. That wasn't meant to happen. And in some ways,
Right.
Paul, I would actually argue that cheap digitization is our enemy, that we actually
All right.
need to have better education. We need to have better quality control on product, regulation, better lifetime control on the Internet of Things, regulation, and actually putting a certain brake on this untrammeled, oh, well, it's broken, you can buy a new model, because that's no way to run a world. That's a way to destroy it. So I'm less worried
Absolutely.
about the big
Geoff?
seven than I'm
Right.
worried about me. I'm terrible,
Right.
right? You shouldn't let me near a keyboard, but I'm speaking on behalf of a few million others who also
Yes.
maybe should have someone looking over their shoulder.
Absolutely. I have a few questions from the audience, and I'd like to be as quick as we can, Geoff, because we are slowly running
Sure.
out of
Okay,
time, but
I'll
I
be
want to
quick.
catch these questions if I can, and some quick answers if I can get them from you. The first one is there any chance to see IPv6 adopted, or maybe will there be some other solution in the near future? What's that other solution in the near
We're
future?
going to fragment the address space. We're never going to have a single unit of address space. IPv6 is largely a doomed vision. I'm sorry, everybody, but quite frankly, packets don't go end to end anymore. They go to the closest data center. So we don't need it. We're actually a name-based networking. We've actually attained the dream. Addresses are so yesterday. Forget about it and move on.
Okay.
Fast enough?
The next question, Geoff. Yes, that was lovely. I like that the pace is wonderful. I want to be able to get through everybody. Thank you. So seems the next question, Geoff, and this is from William Manzioni, asks, seems the next step is AI along with localization data of consumers. Will this drive the next generation of telco business and suppressing current advertisement technology?
There's a certain amount of customization. I'm always amazed that people tell each other Google search terms. Oh, it's over here, just search for that. Because quite frankly, when I search for something and you search for something, we will get entirely different answers. The net is already highly customized, and advertising is highly customized. And that's why people buy Google ads, because they work because of customization. So oddly enough, we are customizing this world, but the price is, oddly enough, that it tends to centralize at the same time as it customizes. Computers have made it possible for one enterprise employing about 40,000 people to service 6 billion customers. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
How do you kind of make that competitive is really the question of our time. And AI won't help here, I'm sorry. AI is actually the tool for that centrality rather than the dispersion. So, yeah, no. Back to you.
Okay. Next question from Luca Ciccelli. I hope I've done your name justice. Two buzzwords are rising: telco cloud versus cloud telco. Who will win the race?
I think the telco's dead, totally dead. Shifting packets is utility. It's like water. It's like electricity. They're just photons. And the underlying communications network that used to be the biggest human enterprise in 1980, they employed more people than any other activity, is now dead. They just don't know it yet. They're walking zombies. The new systems are actually all in this cloud provider network. You only need to look at Google, Amazon, Microsoft. Microsoft reinvented itself not as office processing, but as cloud. Amazon is selling cloud. Google is cloud for advertising. So these are new players, not the old telco players. The old telco players, forget about them. I hope there aren't too many people.
One more question. I've got one final.
Sure.
One final question. We have to be quick because I must move on, Geoff. This is the last one here. So from Maurizio Gioretti, are politicians ready for such a worldwide regulatory defense needed for the Big Seven?
No, totally unprepared. I'm like, GDPR was like trying to perform a delicate piece of surgery with a mallet and a chisel. It's crude, It's complete overreaction, and it didn't have the right effect. A €5 billion fine to Google? Meh, one day's revenue. Not interested. So in some ways, the political armory is certainly bigger than politicians imagine and better, but it's crafted by folk who quite literally are not sufficiently expert in this area. We're asking a whole lot more of our social governance systems, more, I think, than the electoral system and politicians are willing to deliver. The last 4 years in America have been deeply depressing if you think the political system can help drag us out of this mess. This mess we're in actually requires more subtlety, more finesse, a little bit of flair, and more imagination than the current political system is delivering for us. I don't know what the answers are, but I certainly think that what we're doing today isn't really coping. We need to be more imaginative. And with that, I hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Geoff, for being with us. So on that note, thank you, Geoff. On that note, I would like to ask Joy to present his keynote. Thank you, Geoff. Joy?
Yeah. Okay, this is my presentation. Well, just a few words before starting. When I saw Geoff presentation, I said, haha, wonderful. I can do the same. The most I can do is to give some annotation, some integration to what Geoff will say. And so I came out with this musical idea. This is contrappunto, something that is done in music when we have two or more voices for the same piece, and they are independent somehow, but still related from the harmony. And this is my bet. Try to give you some more annotation aside from what Geoff said. I can say you that this is not exactly what I have achieved. So let's go through it. Next slide, please. What I want to talk about, I will talk some variation in the musical sense about growth in general, technology, of course, innovation, as Geoff said, and of course, network, because we are dealing with network. And I'll use a lot of graph, and a very poor quality graph, I'm afraid. Next slide, please. This is my first and probably main consideration in my talk. Let's look at growth. Growth is an exponential thing. And the problem is that we, as a human being, have a brain which is not wired for understanding exponential growth. And this is everyday knowledge now. We are facing exponential growth of pandemic, and we react in very strange and very unpredictable or very low level way. We marvel. We look at scientists who can predict months in advance when will be the peak of the pandemic and say, oh, wonderful, how can you do that? Going back to our sector, I remember a long time ago, 92, the secretary of Internet Society, Tony Rutkowski, predicted just on the base of a couple of million of internet users that in year 2000 we will have 1 billion population. And I have to admit that I still his presentation and use it at the time. It was a very easy prediction to fulfill. because if the growth is still be exponential, at worst, you can make it wrong by 6 months, but sooner or later, 1 billion population was in the number. I give you, probably you know it, a riddle. I know that we, as a homogeneous group of people with sound technical background, we understand exponential growth. But you try this with your friends or your family, and you will find out that it's not so easy. I hope you can read what is written there. I can't. But it said that if you have a water lily plant is growing in a pond, and it doubles size every day, and sooner or later it will kill every other living things in the water. When we have to start doing things, consider if we start be concerned about the growth when the water lily had covered half the pond, which day will be that? You know the answer. I give it to you. Next slide, please. What we engineers and scientists in general make it even more difficult. We use logarithmic scale. How can you understand what is going on looking at the graph on the right? It's almost useless unless you understand logarithmics. Next slide, please. In nature, I talk about a lot about natural sciences in my presentation. There are a lot of natural phenomena with exponential behavior. In general, growth of animals, species, viruses is unconstrained growth, exponential. Only when there are boundaries or limited resources, we see logistic curves, sigmoids. Next slide, please. And usually we are concerned about equilibrium. We see or we believe there is equilibrium in ecosystems, in the life of the planet. But this is not true. If left unconstrained, life grows exponentially. If you look at ourselves, Homo sapiens, we are the best or probably the worst example of exponential growth. In practice, equilibrium is an apparent feature of complex system. Any kind of dynamic nonlinear systems, even the small one, which is the prey-predator system, it exhibits some form of chaos mechanism, which you look at from far away, it looks like equilibrium, but it's not equilibrium. It is a struggle. It is what life is real about. Next slide, please. In economics, we have this example of curves, learning curve, studied a long time ago. Right is just an example applied to avionics. We have Henderson, Boston Consulting Group, experience curve. That means that the more you continue doing the same things, manufacturing, and the better we are. And then the cost decreases at the number of products we manufacture. This is a power curve. This is behind economy of scale. This is the reason why big, large is always an advantage to be better doing things, to dominate markets. Next slide, please. And here we come to innovation, growth and change in technology. If you remember, Christensen has proposed this idea of disruptive innovation 20 years ago, a little more. What is interesting for me is that disruptive innovation must start in collateral segment of the market, not in the mainstream. New technology are immature when they start. They can compete with the mainstream established technologies. They can win in small markets and then year after year improve, learn how to do better, and sooner or later if they are really better, can win even in the high quality, most demanding segment of the market. And this is the apparent strategy through which innovation win. Next slide, please. And this brings me to reminding you the well-known bell curve of the adoption of new technology. New disruptive innovation do not always succeed. Almost on the contrary, most of them fail in the initial phase. They can win the early adopter, but sooner or later they have to face the early majority, and this is the critical moment where they can win or can fail. And as Geoff said, they need to be several times better than the technology they substitute. Otherwise, they will not win. Why this? This is because again, our brain is not perfectly decision machine. Next slide, please. Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics in not in 79, in 202, studied loss aversion. It means that our brain is biased. We value more losing than winning. And this means that we resist change. We resist adopting new things. This is next slide, please. This is a side consideration that I think is important about entrepreneurship. People who choose to be early adopter, choose to do new things, must be considered an endangered species. They are really crazy. If they use their brain correctly, they will never do anything new. And as endangered species, entrepreneurs must be protected. Capitalism invented the principle of limited company to limit the risk and to protect entrepreneurs. We must have a symmetric rule in competition to give a chance to newcomers, and we need antitrust law somehow. This is something that Geoff had just demolished in these last answers that he gave. Next slide, please. This is just a show of generic culture. In science too, we have something like innovative innovation, disruptive innovation, and they call paradigm shift. But let's go faster because I'm consuming my time. Next slide, please. Let me go to our sector, technology. The best example of exponential growth that we have is fantastic, is the Moore law, firstly devised by Moore in 1965, so more than 50 years ago. And this is the only case I know of exponential growth. It has no limit, internal limit. Usually when you have something more of this, we have less of that, and there are some drawback, some trade-off. You have to make some choices. This is the only case that for 50 years just increased all its metrics, just reducing the geometry. You have smaller and smaller chips. You have finer resolution for your transistors, and you have more density, less power, more speed, and so and so and so. There is only just one small bit of an external trade-off. The investment for making a new fab, a new line of production grows exponentially. This means that chip manufacturing has been more and more concentrated along these lines. Next slide, please. Moore's law is, for me, the fuel that has powered all the technological evolution race that we have had for the last 50 years, from electronics to networking to IT and on and on. What is its promise? It is exponential, sustainable, predictable future. If today we have X, tomorrow we will count on more than X, 4 times more X. And all projects that have been based on more computing power, bigger memories, lower power usage, all of them have been fulfilled and been realized. Next slide, please. Networking. Just to propose you a few graphs before finishing my presentation. Computer networks, for me, computer networks start being important when the cost of the electronic equipment at the end became lower than the cost of the transmission of bits. And they grew when the transmission cost became almost independent of distance, and that there was internet. And finally, with fiber optics, computer networks skyrocketed because the marginal cost of data transmission approached almost zero. And this is the optical fiber technology that is disruptive beginning year 2000. Next slide, please. This is my last graph, sorry. Network effect. This is one more example of a power curve, something that grows by the square of the number of subscribers. This explains the competitive advantages of large telco operators, because the value of a company is proportional to the square of the number of subscribers. but it also applies to network operator. Now we are no more telco. We have network operators, new media, and the so-called over-the-top players. Next slide, please. Just a little bit of hope about this market dominated by a few very large players. If we think about over the top, social media, very large players. One thing that characterizes them is subscription are free. The same players, the same customers can be counted as subscribers by several players. What is the rival good in telco market where subscriber now is eyeballs or hence user-generated content or attention time is the rival good. That means that anytime you lose attention, you lose active users, you are losing value linearly because it's the power curve used in reverse. Don't forget that less than 20 years ago, MySpace was big player and Facebook was just starting. MySpace disappeared. So it disappeared very, very fast, at least as a major play, not as a name. So no over-the-top player is safe from abrupt changes in value, in subscriber base. None of them is completely guaranteed of its future. Next slide, please. This is my placeholder slide just to tell you that I'm finishing. I don't talk about this wonderful book that David Clark, who was one of the father of the internet, was head of the Internet Architecture Board until 1990, and the man who invented the slogan "rough consensus," just to give you an idea. And this book has been published 2 years ago. It is a book on architecture. Very interesting, but I have no time to talk about it. So I finished my presentation. Last slide, please. And because I wanted to have a citation, a quotation as well, I find out something related to music. But what is said here is that I am not very happy with my presentation because most of the things I wrote are not mine, and the few I did are not really very deep. That's it. I can't hear you. Paul?
I had my mic on mute there. Thank you very much,
Okay.
Joy. What I was saying was you raised some very good points, not only for Italy, but also for Europe, when we take a look at these large players and where we have the disruption of innovation coming in. And you're right. There were a lot of these over-the-top players that existed. They shifted out very quickly, all right, with some of these coming in. But these big seven seem to have quite a strong hold on Europe. And again, we have this dilemma in front of us when we mention the disruption. Will it be with some innovation coming from the European side, which it should really, with Italy included? Or is there also a little bit of the regulatory body government bit that will come into this space to try to level this playing field out, making sure that we have a competitive Europe moving forward in the internet?
I'm not really optimistic about the role of Europe in this. I don't think that the regulatory approach will win in the end. I like the image that Geoff gave the idea of this bunch of very large company like a boiling kettle with the pressure that is growing, growing, and growing, because we can't stop innovation. It's like life. You can keep stopping innovation. Something will happen sooner or later. If the pressure build up, somewhere this kettle will break, and we can know where.
Right.
We can reverse.
Yes, it's very unpredictable indeed.
We can reverse the point of view. What if the interest of this big company they started as very innovative company. I can't forget that the motto of Google was "Do not evil," because they were concerned about the risk that they had doing what they were starting doing, and if they want to be part of the innovation world after 2050, let me look very, very in the future, which is not my problem. If they want to be player there, they must do something. Breaking up a huge company like this is not only an option for the US government, it may be an option for the company itself. There have been several examples of companies that if they were interested in keep an edge in innovation, we have to split. We have to break out some part of it and say, okay, you go another way. Here are some money. Do your part. Invent something new. You are not anymore part of Google. You are a competitor. The other side of the coin is I'm a Facebook, I am a Google, and just to believe that I'm still on the edge of innovation, I continually cherry picking startups. But I don't use them. I kill them. So something must be wrong.
Yes. And on that note, Joy, I can say I'm afraid I could spend the whole day speaking to both of you about these topics, but I'm afraid we're out of time. So what I'm going to suggest is that we bring us all back here. I just wanted to give a special thank you to Geoff and Joy for being here with us. And I encourage the participants to get in touch with them if they have any questions after this session. These two gentlemen are not only very bright individuals, but they're actually really good fun as well. So, and I know that they would be very keen to hear from you. Which is great. So I think I'm going to hand you back in a moment to the command center. We possibly have a short break before we get into the next part of the afternoon program. Possibly, possibly not. I think the command center will let us know this. But from what I can see, the fun part of the day is actually about to start. I know that you Italians like to have a good time, and I hear that there are some prizes coming up in the afternoon as well. So from our part, I'd just like to say happy birthday, Mix. At 20 years, you look fabulous. And again, thank you very much to our panelists and our keynote speakers here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Cheerio. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.